We are now going to begin our look at the secondary sector of the economy, which, as you know, is the manufacturing and industrial sector of the economy. You also know this. The Industrial Revolution began in England in the 1750s. The Industrial Revolution resulted in lots and lots of changes for people, society, the planet as a whole. One of the obvious things is that people began to group together in cities and live in much greater proximity to each other, much closer proximity to each other. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, though, most manufacturing was associated with what's called cottage industries. This is basically what it sounds like it means. Like, I'm going to make something in me cottage, right? Like that. So what happened was, this was the manufacture of goods at home or in small shops by small businesses for local consumption. Of course, it still goes on today to some extent, but manufacturing has really become a completely different game than it once was. It would have been jobs like blacksmiths and silversmiths and tailors and cobblers, basket weavers and pottery makers, tanners, and so on. And their market would have been a local market. They would have been selling to their local town or village. So, for example, if you made horseshoes in the northern part of England, you were not selling your horseshoes to London because London had its own blacksmiths and horseshoe makers. So everything was about local consumption at that point, prior to the Industrial Revolution. And when the Industrial Revolution happens in the 1750s, the focus changes and the market changes. In other words, what's going to be manufactured and where it's going to be sold changes. Manufacturing goes from being small scale to large scale. So in other words, not just a local population to buy your products. The switch goes from local and regional, and it becomes national, continental, and global. What's really crazy, of course, is that we're so used to this now that we don't even realize that a fairly short time ago in human history, everything was radically different. In England, the place where the Industrial Revolution begins, its birthplace, labor was needed to work in the factories. So the government created what it called the Enclosure Program. This was designed to force farmers from the land and move them into the cities to begin to work in the factories. In other words, a complete shift from primary sector to secondary sector. So people went from having local farms that fed their local population, their villages, their towns, to massive industrialized agriculture that was designed to send food great distances. The farmer may not have even eaten the food that he or she was growing because it was going to be sold to the cities. Because, of course, if you're living like this, you can feed yourself. But if you're living like this, you don't have time to produce food too. So the food has to come into you. And that was the idea of the Enclosure Program, to take the farms and make them much larger with a much larger focus. Very much like industry itself as a result of the Industrial Revolution. Three types of industries grew initially. Iron and steel. Now, of course, this had to do with building bigger buildings like the factories themselves in the cities. But it also had to do with laying down rail line and making trains and eventually ships made out of steel to transport materials, and then automobiles and so on. And textiles. Look, textiles is clothing, basically. Did you ever look at your clothing to see where it comes from? We know now it comes from all over the world. But there was a time, not that long ago, that you either made your clothes or you bought your clothes locally, and you did not have a lot of them. And then food processing and candy. Remember, food processing is taking the raw product and turning it into a more usable product. Like, for example, taking a grain of wheat and grinding it up and turning it into flour. By doing these things, you could preserve the food for a longer period of time, transport it greater distances, and not have to worry as much about spoiling. And that helped feed the Industrial Revolution and allowed it to progress as it progressed.